Sometimes the moment that changes everything begins with a room that suddenly goes quiet. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was the kind of event people in Manhattan talked about for months. The kind of night where the chandeliers looked like frozen constellations above polished marble floors, and every table carried more money and jewelry alone than most neighborhoods would see in a lifetime. Waiters in black jackets moved carefully between guests holding crystal glasses of champagne. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage, and outside on Park Avenue a row of black SUVs stretched half a block under the glow of streetlights. Danielle Carter stood near the center of it all, calm and composed, the deep emerald color of her evening dress catching the warm gold light as she listened to the quiet hum of conversations around her. She had spent the last 10 years building Carter Dynamics from a modest startup in a rented office outside Detroit into one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence logistics companies in the United States, a company that quietly powered shipping routes, warehouse automation, and supply chains across the country. Tonight was supposed to mark the next step, a historic partnership rumored to be worth more than $1 billion with the Whitmore family, a dynasty that had controlled investment firms, media networks, and real estate across Manhattan for 3 generations. Around the ballroom, people whispered her name with curiosity, some with admiration, some with the careful politeness reserved for someone who had risen faster than the old rules of society expected. At the far end of the room, Richard Whitmore stood beside his wife Victoria and their son Andrew, their presence drawing attention the way gravity pulls everything toward it. The family known as much for their influence as for their quiet belief that certain doors in the world had always belonged to them. Danielle watched the room the way successful leaders do, noticing details others ignored, the slight hesitation when some guests approached her, the way others studied her company's name on the gala program, as if trying to understand how a black woman from Detroit had ended up at the center of a deal that Wall Street analysts had been discussing for weeks. The evening air inside the ballroom felt warm, but beneath the music and polite laughter there was tension, the kind that forms when old power meets something new. It does not fully understand. When Danielle finally stepped forward toward the Whitmore table with the calm confidence that had carried her through every boardroom negotiation of her career, the conversations around the ballroom softened, like waves pulling back from a shoreline. Richard Whitmore lifted his glass slightly. Victoria's expression remained unreadable, and Andrew leaned back in his chair with a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. For a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Danielle stopped just a few feet from them, her voice steady and respectful as she greeted the family and acknowledged the partnership that had brought hundreds of the city's most powerful people together under one roof. But before anyone could respond, something unexpected shifted in the air, the kind of small moment that causes music to fade and conversations to stop. The kind of moment when every person in a crowded room senses that something important has just happened, and in that sudden stillness Danielle Carter realized that this night, the night meant to celebrate a billion-dollar alliance, was about to become something entirely different. The silence inside the ballroom did not break immediately, because moments like this in rooms filled with powerful people never explode, they tighten slowly like a string being pulled too far. Danielle Carter remained standing exactly where she was, the soft glow of the chandeliers reflecting in the polished marble beneath her heels, while dozens of eyes shifted between her and the Whitmore family. The jazz quartet near the stage had stopped playing without even realizing it, the pianist's hands hovering above the keys as if the music itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Richard Whitmore watched Danielle with the calm expression of a man who had spent his entire life assuming control of every room he entered, while Victoria Whitmore adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist with a small, deliberate motion that suggested she was completely comfortable with the attention now centered on their table. Andrew Whitmore leaned slightly back in his chair, his gaze moving slowly across the crowd, as if measuring how many of the city's most influential guests were witnessing the moment. Danielle felt the weight of the room, but did not rush to respond. Instead, she let her eyes move across the ballroom, taking in the familiar signs of power that had always defined gatherings like this one. Hedge fund managers whispering near the bar, tech investors studying the scene from behind their champagne glasses, reporters from financial magazines pretending not to stare. A decade earlier Danielle would have been invisible in a place like this, just another young entrepreneur, hoping someone important might give her 5 minutes of attention. Tonight she was the reason the entire room had gone silent. Carter Dynamics had become impossible to ignore over the past 2 years. The company's artificial intelligence systems quietly transforming shipping networks across the United States and saving corporations millions of dollars in efficiency. Analysts on Wall Street had begun calling her the architect of the next logistics revolution, and the Whitmore partnership had been described by several financial networks as the deal that would reshape global supply chains. Yet despite the numbers, despite the headlines, Danielle could still feel the unspoken question floating through the ballroom like a draft of cold air. Some of the guests were not wondering whether the deal would succeed. They were wondering whether she truly belonged here. She saw it in the subtle expressions around the room, the raised eyebrows, the quiet calculations behind polite smiles. Old money families like the Whitmores had built their reputations over generations, passing influence down like heirlooms, while Danielle had built her company one sleepless night at a time, coding prototypes in a cramped office above a Detroit warehouse district where the heating system barely worked during Michigan winters. The distance between those two worlds could not be measured in miles or dollars. It was measured in assumptions. Richard Whitmore finally lifted his glass and took a slow sip of champagne, the faint clink of crystal echoing slightly in the silence. His voice when he spoke was calm, almost conversational, yet every person in the ballroom leaned in to hear it. He mentioned the scale of the partnership, the opportunity it represented for both companies, the future it promised for American technology leadership. On the surface, the words sounded generous, but beneath them Danielle heard something else, a tone she had encountered many times before in boardrooms where men twice her age tried to decide whether she was a leader or simply a temporary exception to their expectations. Danielle kept her posture relaxed, her shoulders steady, the calm discipline she had learned during years of negotiations guiding her breathing. She knew that rooms like this tested more than business strategy. They tested patience. They tested dignity. And as the Whitmore family continued speaking about billion-dollar opportunities and global expansion, Danielle Carter understood, with absolute clarity, that this night was no longer about a contract. It was about something far older than money, something far more powerful than reputation, the quiet question of who was allowed to stand at the center of a room like this and be seen as the person in charge. For a few seconds after Richard Whitmore finished speaking, no one in the ballroom said anything, because the people gathered inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala were experts at reading moments of power, and everyone could feel that something unspoken was unfolding in the space between the billionaire family and the woman standing before them. Danielle Carter held Richard Whitmore's gaze without raising her voice or shifting her posture, the steady calm of someone who had spent years walking into rooms where people expected her to hesitate and instead discovered she never did. The quiet weight of the ballroom settled around her shoulders like warm air, and she could almost hear the memories of a different world whispering behind the polished walls. Detroit in the winter smelled like cold steel and engine oil, and the small apartment where she grew up had windows that rattled whenever the wind came off the river. Her mother had worked long shifts cleaning hotel rooms along Interstate 94, leaving before sunrise and coming home with tired feet, but a quiet pride that never faded. Danielle remembered sitting at the kitchen table after school with a secondhand laptop that took nearly 5 minutes to start, teaching herself programming languages through free online courses while snow piled against the apartment building outside. Back then, success did not look like champagne and chandeliers. It looked like a stable internet connection and enough determination to stay awake long after midnight. Years later, when Carter Dynamics began taking shape, the first office had been a narrow space above a shipping warehouse where freight trucks rumbled past the windows at all hours of the night. Danielle had built her first logistics algorithm between stacks of borrowed equipment and whiteboards filled with equations that mapped cargo routes across the United States. Investors did not line up outside the door in those early days. Most meetings ended with polite smiles and quiet. Doubts about whether a young black founder from Detroit could compete with established technology firms in Silicon Valley or New York. Yet the code kept improving. The software learned faster routes. Warehouses processed shipments more efficiently. Within 3 years, several major retailers were quietly using Carter Dynamics systems to manage regional supply chains across thousands of miles of highway and rail networks. Danielle never chased headlines, but the results were impossible to ignore. Eventually, analysts began mentioning her company on financial news channels, first cautiously and then with growing excitement as the numbers climbed quarter after quarter. Tonight's partnership with the Whitmore family had been described as the moment Carter Dynamics would fully step into the global spotlight, combining Danielle's artificial intelligence platform with Whitmore Capital's international logistics infrastructure stretching from ports on the West Coast to distribution hubs across Europe. Yet standing there under the golden lights of the ballroom, Danielle sensed something that had nothing to do with contracts or software or global expansion. It was the quiet assumption that had lived in rooms like this for generations, the belief that influence followed certain familiar patterns, that leadership wore certain familiar faces. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged glances, the subtle language of high society playing out in lifted eyebrows and measured expressions. Some appeared curious, others cautious, a few quietly impressed by Danielle's composure. Andrew Whitmore tapped one finger against the edge of the table, while Victoria Whitmore studied Danielle with the cool focus of someone accustomed to judging people within seconds. Richard Whitmore finally set his champagne glass down and leaned slightly forward, his voice steady as he spoke again about partnership, about opportunity, about the future both families could build together. The words sounded generous, but the tone beneath them carried an expectation that the path forward had already been decided. Danielle listened carefully, her expression calm. Yet somewhere beneath the quiet rhythm of the ballroom, she felt a shift beginning. The kind of shift that turns an ordinary evening into a moment people remember for years. Because sometimes the most powerful decision in a room full of billionaires is not the one written into the contract on the table. Sometimes it is the one made silently by the person standing in front of them. The quiet tension that had settled over the ballroom did not disappear. It simply shifted into something sharper, something people could feel even through the soft music that cautiously returned from the quartet near the stage. Danielle Carter remained standing before the Whitmore family table, her expression calm but thoughtful, as if she were weighing more than the numbers attached to the contract everyone in the room knew about. Richard Whitmore's eyes stayed on her with the composed patience of a man who had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar decisions. Yet there was a subtle expectation in the way he leaned forward that suggested he believed the next move belonged to him. Around them, the guests resumed quiet conversations, though their voices remained lower than before, like a crowd inside a theater waiting for the next scene to unfold. Victoria Whitmore adjusted the cuff of her evening jacket and studied Danielle with a faint smile that never fully warmed her expression, the kind of polite smile that carried a message beneath it. Andrew Whitmore glanced briefly toward a group of investors standing near the bar and then back at Danielle, as if silently reminding everyone present who usually held the advantage in rooms like this. Danielle listened as Richard Whitmore began describing the timeline of the partnership once again. The expansion of distribution networks, the integration of Carter Dynamics artificial intelligence into Whitmore Capital's international infrastructure, the billions of dollars projected to move through the combined system within the next 5 years. His words flowed smoothly, the language of confidence and authority that had shaped his reputation across Wall Street for decades. Yet Danielle noticed something subtle in the way he spoke about her company, the careful phrasing that placed Whitmore Capital at the center of the future they were discussing. She had heard versions of this tone before in earlier negotiations, the quiet assumption that Carter Dynamics would become a powerful tool inside someone else's empire rather than remain an independent force shaping the industry itself. Danielle's fingers rested lightly on the folder she carried, the documents inside representing years of work, countless nights of problem-solving, and a team of engineers who had trusted her vision when very few investors had. She remembered the early days when every contract mattered because it meant another month of payroll for a small group of programmers working out of a building that smelled like engine grease and cardboard boxes. She remembered the first time a national retailer trusted Carter Dynamics with managing a regional distribution network across several hundred miles of highway. She remembered the moment her software predicted a shipping disruption before any human analyst noticed it, saving the client millions of dollars in delays. Those moments had built the foundation that now brought her to this ballroom in Manhattan surrounded by people whose families had controlled industries long before she was born. Richard Whitmore finished outlining his expectations and lifted his glass again, the faint clink of crystal echoing gently through the room, as if it were a signal that the evening's most important decision was about to be finalized. Several investors nearby leaned closer to listen. A reporter from a financial magazine quietly opened a notebook. Danielle Carter looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the faces of people who had spent their lives believing influence followed familiar paths. Then she returned her gaze to the Whitmore family, her voice steady and respectful as she began to speak. And in that moment it became clear that the direction of the night was no longer as predictable as many people in the room had assumed. Danielle Carter allowed the quiet of the ballroom to linger for a moment before speaking, because she understood something many people in powerful rooms often forgot. Silence could be just as powerful as words. The chandeliers above reflected softly against the marble floor while hundreds of guests waited to hear what she would say next. She looked at Richard Whitmore first, then at Victoria and Andrew, acknowledging them with the calm respect that had defined every negotiation of her career. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady and clear, carrying easily across the elegant room without needing to rise above the level of normal conversation. She thanked the Whitmore family for hosting an evening dedicated to innovation and opportunity, and she acknowledged the scale of the partnership they had been discussing for months. Several investors nearby nodded approvingly as she spoke, expecting the moment to lead naturally toward the formal announcement everyone had anticipated since the invitations for the gala had been mailed weeks earlier. Danielle continued, explaining how Carter Dynamics had always been built on the idea that technology should create smarter systems rather than simply bigger ones. She spoke about the engineers on her team who had spent years refining algorithms that could predict supply chain disruptions before they occurred, about the warehouse managers across the country who had trusted her company to improve their efficiency, and about the retailers whose distribution networks now moved faster and more reliably because of the software she had developed. Her words were thoughtful and measured, the tone of a leader who knew the value of every milestone along the journey that had brought her company to this moment. Richard Whitmore listened with an expression that suggested he was satisfied with the direction of the conversation, as if the evening were unfolding exactly the way he expected. Victoria Whitmore leaned slightly closer to the table, her attention focused on Danielle with polite interest, while Andrew Whitmore rested his elbow against the chair and watched the surrounding crowd, clearly aware that many of the city's most influential investors were studying every detail of the exchange. Danielle paused briefly, her eyes moving across the ballroom once more, taking in the quiet curiosity that had settled among the guests. Then she spoke again, this time shifting her words away from the history of Carter Dynamics and toward the meaning of partnership itself. She explained that the most successful alliances in business were not defined only by the value of the contract or the scale of the opportunity. They were defined by the respect shared between the people involved. She spoke about how true collaboration required trust, understanding, and the belief that every voice at the table carried equal weight when decisions were made. The room grew still again, because the tone of her message had changed in a way that many listeners had not expected. A few guests exchanged quick glances, sensing that Danielle Carter was guiding the evening towards something far more significant than a routine announcement of a billion-dollar deal. Richard Whitmore's posture shifted slightly as he listened, his expression becoming more attentive than before. Victoria Whitmore tilted her head with quiet curiosity, while Andrew Whitmore's confident smile faded into something more cautious. Danielle Carter rested one hand lightly on the folder she carried, the documents inside representing years of work and the future direction of her company. She took one steady breath, then looked directly at the Whitmore family as she prepared to say the words that would quietly change the course of the entire evening. Danielle Carter held the quiet attention of the ballroom without raising her voice, because confidence did not need volume when it was built on years of hard-earned certainty. The chandeliers above continued to glow softly while the room waited for her next words, and the faint clink of glassware somewhere near the bar echoed lightly through the silence. Richard Whitmore's eyes remained fixed on her, the practiced composure of a veteran financier hiding whatever calculations might have been forming in his mind. Victoria Whitmore sat perfectly still beside him, her posture elegant and controlled, though the faint tightening of her expression suggested that she was beginning to sense the direction of Danielle's thoughts. Andrew Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair and glanced across the ballroom, where several well-known investors had stopped their conversations completely, each of them quietly aware that the evening was no longer following the expected script. Danielle spoke calmly about the scale of the opportunity in front of them, acknowledging that the partnership being discussed represented one of the most significant technology collaborations of the decade. She described the reach of Whitmore Capital's logistics infrastructure, the ports, rail yards, and distribution centers that stretched across continents. And she explained how Carter Dynamics had spent years refining artificial intelligence systems capable of managing complex supply chains across thousands of miles of highways and shipping lanes. Several guests nodded with approval as she spoke, recognizing the rare combination of innovation and capital that had brought both companies together in the first place. Yet as Danielle continued, her tone shifted slightly, not in anger but in clarity, the way a leader's voice changes when they are about to say something that truly matters. She spoke about the foundation of every successful company she had built, a belief that technology and partnerships must be grounded in mutual respect. Without that respect, she explained, even the most profitable alliance could become fragile over time. The room grew noticeably quieter as those words settled across the marble floor and crystal tables. Danielle's gaze moved briefly around the ballroom once more, acknowledging the many faces watching her carefully, the reporters, investors, and executives who understood the weight of what was being said, even though the conversation remained outwardly polite. She then returned her attention to the Whitmore family, her posture steady, her voice thoughtful. She explained that Carter Dynamics had never been created simply to become part of someone else's empire. It had been built to challenge outdated systems and to create new possibilities for the industries that relied on them. That mission required partnerships, but it also required independence, dignity, and trust between those who worked together. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly as he listened, the first subtle sign that the direction of the evening might be shifting beyond the comfortable expectations he had carried into the gala. Victoria Whitmore's composed expression hardened almost imperceptibly, while Andrew Whitmore's earlier confidence faded into a careful silence. Danielle Carter rested her hand on the folder containing the proposed agreement, the weight of the moment clear in the stillness that surrounded them. She paused just long enough for every person in the ballroom to realize that the next sentence she spoke would determine far more than the future of a single contract. Danielle Carter allowed the pause to stretch for several seconds, the kind of silence that gathers weight in a room where every person understands that the next sentence may determine the direction of a billion-dollar future. The chandeliers above reflected softly across the polished marble floor, while guests leaned forward just slightly, the quiet language of anticipation passing from table to table. Richard Whitmore watched her carefully, the calm confidence of a man who had built an empire resting in the stillness of his posture. Victoria Whitmore's gaze remained steady and composed, yet the faint tightening at the edge of her expression suggested she was no longer entirely certain how the evening would end. Andrew Whitmore folded his hands together on the table, his earlier ease replaced with the alert focus of someone who suddenly realized that the moment was no longer under his family's control. Danielle spoke with the same thoughtful calm she had carried through every stage of her career, her voice clear enough to reach the far corners of the ballroom without rising above the gentle hum of the room. She explained that Carter Dynamics had grown from a simple idea into a national technology platform because every person on her team believed in building systems that improved the lives of the people who depended on them. Truck drivers delivering goods across hundreds of miles of highway, warehouse managers coordinating shipments through the night, and small business owners waiting for products to arrive on time all depended on the networks her company had designed. For Danielle, those people were never just numbers inside an algorithm. They were the reason the company existed. Several guests nodded quietly as she spoke, recognizing the rare sincerity in her words. She then shifted her gaze toward the Whitmore family again, her tone still respectful but now unmistakably firm. She explained that partnerships in business were not only about combining resources or expanding markets. They were about shared values. Without those values, even the most impressive agreement could eventually collapse under the weight of misunderstanding and imbalance. The The room grew so quiet that the faint sound of ice settling in a nearby glass could be heard across the marble floor. Danielle rested both hands gently on the folder she carried and looked at Richard Whitmore directly. She thanked him for the opportunity his family had offered, acknowledging the scale and influence of the Whitmore network and the history behind the name that carried so much weight across financial markets. But then she spoke the sentence that no one in the ballroom had expected. She explained that Carter Dynamics had been built to stand on its own vision, not to be absorbed into a structure that did not fully reflect the respect and equality her company represented. A ripple of surprise moved quietly through the guests as the meaning of her words settled in. Andrew Whitmore straightened slightly in his chair, while Victoria Whitmore's composed expression hardened into something colder and more calculating. Richard Whitmore's eyes narrowed just enough to reveal that the direction of the evening had shifted beyond his expectations. Danielle Carter closed the folder slowly, the soft sound of paper touching paper echoing lightly in the still ballroom. Then she placed the folder on the table between them, not as a rejection filled with anger, but as a decision made with calm certainty. And in that quiet motion, everyone present realized that the future they had assumed would be announced tonight had just been rewritten. For several seconds, no one in the ballroom moved, as if the entire room had become part of the silence Danielle Carter had just created. The folder resting on the table between her and the Whitmore family seemed far heavier than the pages inside it, because everyone present understood what that small gesture represented. A billion-dollar partnership had just been declined, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a calm certainty that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair, studying Danielle with the careful focus of a man who had spent his life calculating outcomes several steps ahead. Yet this moment had not appeared in any of the projections his advisors had prepared before the gala. Victoria Whitmore remained perfectly composed, though the faint stiffness in her posture suggested that the situation had moved beyond the comfortable control she expected from events hosted under her family name. Andrew Whitmore glanced around the ballroom and noticed something that made him pause. Several investors were no longer watching the Whitmore family. They were watching Danielle Carter. Across the room, quiet conversations began to ripple through the crowd like wind across water. Executives whispered to one another, analysts exchanged quick glances, and a reporter from a financial magazine wrote rapidly inside a small notebook. Already aware that tomorrow morning's headlines would not be about the deal everyone had expected. Danielle Carter stood calmly in the center of it all, her posture relaxed, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. She did not look like someone who had just rejected a historic opportunity. She looked like someone who had simply made the right decision. Richard Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice controlled but noticeably more measured than before. He reminded Danielle that partnerships of this scale rarely appeared twice, that the resources and global reach of Whitmore Capital represented a level of influence few technology companies could match on their own. The words were delivered with professional politeness, yet beneath them was the unmistakable message that turning away from such an offer carried risks. Danielle listened respectfully and nodded once, acknowledging the truth inside his statement. She understood better than most people in the room how difficult it was to build a company strong enough to stand independently against established financial networks. But she also understood something that had shaped every major decision in her life. Opportunities built on imbalance often carried hidden costs that appeared years later when the original excitement had faded. Danielle spoke quietly, explaining that Carter Dynamics had never been defined by the size of the deals it accepted. The company had been defined by the principles guiding those decisions. Her engineers, her partners, and the communities depending on the systems they created all trusted her to protect that foundation. She explained that growth meant little if it required sacrificing the respect that made collaboration possible in the first place. The words were not directed only at the Whitmore family. They were heard by every person in the ballroom who had ever faced a moment where success demanded a compromise of values. Victoria Whitmore's gaze remained fixed on Danielle, the faintest hint of realization appearing behind her composed expression. Andrew Whitmore looked down at the folder on the table as if seeing it differently now. Richard Whitmore remained silent for a long moment before finally giving a small nod, the quiet acknowledgement of a businessman who recognized determination when he saw it. Danielle Carter then lifted the folder gently from the table and held it at her side, not as a symbol of victory, but simply as the closing of one path so another could begin. And as the conversations around the ballroom slowly resumed, it became clear that the most important outcome of the evening was not the deal that had been declined, but the message that had been delivered in front of everyone who had witnessed it. The ballroom slowly began to breathe again after the decision had been made, conversations returning in careful waves as the city's most powerful guests processed what they had just witnessed. Danielle Carter stood for a moment longer beside the Whitmore table, not with the posture of someone celebrating a victory, but with the quiet composure of someone who understood that the most meaningful choices in life rarely felt dramatic in the moment they were made. Richard Whitmore watched her with thoughtful silence, his expression no longer defined by confidence alone, but by a deeper recognition that the night had revealed something about leadership that could not be measured in balance sheets or stock valuations. Victoria Whitmore remained still, her gaze following Danielle as she stepped away from the table, the faint reflection of the chandeliers dancing across the polished marble floor beneath them. Andrew Whitmore glanced toward the surrounding guests and saw something that surprised him even more than the rejected contract. Several investors were nodding with quiet respect, their attention still fixed on Danielle as she moved calmly through the ballroom. The reporter near the bar closed a notebook with a thoughtful expression, already imagining how the story would be told the next morning when the financial world woke to headlines about the decision made tonight. Danielle did not rush as she walked across the room, acknowledging a few polite greetings from guests who had watched the exchange with interest. Her steps were steady and unhurried, the rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that dignity often carried more influence than urgency. When she reached the entrance hall just beyond the ballroom doors, the sounds of music and conversation softened behind her, replaced by the quieter atmosphere of the marble corridor leading toward the building's main exit. Through the tall windows overlooking Park Avenue, she could see the glow of city lights stretching across Manhattan, taxis moving steadily along the avenue, and the distant skyline rising into the night sky. For a moment she paused there, looking out at the city that had challenged her more than once, but had also given her the opportunity to prove what determination and vision could build. Danielle thought about the engineers working late in the Carter Dynamics headquarters several blocks away, about the young programmers who believed they were part of something meaningful, and about the thousands of drivers, warehouse managers, and small business owners whose daily work depended on the systems her company had created. The future of that company had not been decided by a single contract tonight. It had been strengthened by a choice that protected the values that built it in the first place. Outside the entrance, a line of cars waited beneath the soft glow of streetlights, their drivers standing patiently beside open doors. Danielle stepped out onto the sidewalk and breathed in the cool night air of Manhattan, the distant hum of traffic blending with the quiet rhythm of the city that never truly slept. Behind her, the Whitmore Foundation Gala continued, conversations now filled with speculation about the decision that had quietly reshaped the evening. Inside that ballroom, many people would remember the moment for years, not because a billion-dollar deal had been signed, but because someone had shown that leadership did not come from the weight of wealth or tradition. It came from the courage to choose respect over convenience and integrity over expectation. Danielle Carter walked down the steps toward the waiting car, the lights of the city stretching before her like a horizon of new possibilities. And as the door closed gently behind her, the story of the night carried forward into the streets of Manhattan, where the future of Carter Dynamics would continue to grow on its own terms.